Welcome to In Pursuit of Darkness, a detective's journey that reveals the terrifying depths of human darkness and violence through the lens of Michigan's most successful and prolific violent crime investigator. I'm your host, Michael Minzey, and together with my father, David Minzey, we recount the investigations of Michigan's most terrifying and violent crimes. Involved in over 10,000 violent crime investigations, he is a retired Michigan State Police detective, former manager of the Michigan State Police Violent Crimes Unit, and an expert criminal profiler. His relentless pursuit of justice brought him face to face with some of the most heinous killers, rapists, and violent offenders. These are his stories in Pursuit of Darkness. On today's episode, we'll be discussing an intriguing case that comes from the rural area of Oscoda County, Michigan in the summer of 1980. What started out as a fun weekend of drinks at a local bar and softball games took a disastrous turn after a series of car failures led Cherita Thomas to go missing. Her story and disappearance would take 25 years before investigators would make an arrest related to her disappearance.
Yeah, this is a very sad story. It involves a young black female who was living in the Tawas area at the time. She was in her early 20s, and she had a young daughter, 4 years old. And she was living in that area because of her boyfriend, who was a security guard at Fort Smith Air Force Base. That base has since been closed, but at the time it was like having an additional city next to Tawas. So on August 8th, she and her friend decided to go to a bar and then visit a softball game where they knew many of the players. Unfortunately, when they got into the bar, there were some comments made that were racially motivated, and when she and her friend left, the bartender actually said, "Don't come back here again." Well, they went to the softball game, and when the players heard what had happened, they decided, we're going to go back to that bar, and they did. But there was no problems after that. And as the night wore on, our victim here felt that she needed to go pick up her daughter and get her home and get her to bed. The friend of hers decided that she did not want to leave then, so she gave her car to the victim. As she was driving home, she gets within a couple of miles or so of her house, and the car overheats and stalls. Fortunately, there was a car full of men who stopped by to help her, and I understand perfectly why she wouldn't want to get into a car with them. But they did help her. They poured water in the radiator. They used duct tape to cover the hole, and she was able to drive away. Unfortunately, the duct tape failed, and about a mile or two later, the same thing happened. The car overheated and stalled, and she's basically sitting out there in the car by herself, and this is late at night. There is a little conflicting information as to what might have happened after this. There were several people who said that she likely walked to a bar that was nearby and tried to get some help for the car. But everyone who saw the car sitting where it finally stalled said that somebody, a male who had a beard, drove up in a blue pickup truck. And after some time with the car, apparently he couldn't get the car started. So the two of them drove off. That was the last time anybody saw this woman. And so the case was reported as a missing person case. And so immediately the next day, there are a number of people who start looking. They go to the car. They find out that the car keys are gone, but the victim's purse is still inside. And this is an area that has a lot of state forest and federal forest locations. And so there was a search that started the next day in an attempt to locate the victim here. That search was unsuccessful. The case then was turned over to the police department, who initiated a search, but at this point it's still a missing person case. Well, this investigation eventually runs out of directions. Back then, we're talking about the 1980s, and we didn't have some things that we do today, like the DNA assessment. So she's put into the computer, and no one responds to the missing person case. Well, this goes on for a great period of time, and it wasn't until the mid-90s that enough information was developed to bring an individual at least in for questioning. The first person that they looked at was a federal fugitive who had a blue pickup truck, but he was ultimately eliminated as a suspect due to an alibi that clearly put him out of the area. The person who pops up next is an individual who knew the victim, actually lived quite close to her, had talked to her and met with her several times before. However, during the investigation, he denied even knowing her. And he made such statements as, he took her to a restaurant, which was later deemed to be closed at the time. And a number of other things take place where this individual is clearly lying. So he is arrested on those charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. And that eventually reaches court case in Oscoda County. Following the prosecution's case, they were decided that there was insufficient evidence to support a murder charge. So the case is basically appealed to the appellate court. The appellate court takes a look at it and sends it back down to the circuit court to take another look at this case. In the interim, this individual, who is now a suspect, was convicted of obstruction and lying to the police, or perjury.
So, real quick, how did this second suspect pop on the radar?
He kind of pops up all over the place. He was in the bar initially when the victim and her friend came in. He knew her because he only lived a short distance from her. And he had talked to her for a long period of time, and he had a blue pickup.
I would imagine that's where you would want to start, right? If you have some sort of witness testimony or witness identifying a blue pickup. I mean, I imagine, it is a rural area. There's probably tons of pickups, but it couldn't be a huge list. Is it at the time, like you said, in the 1980s, where they didn't have a computer, they could just print out all the blue pickups, right?
Well, most of the things in the computer, unless they're stolen, do not have a color attached. And unfortunately, there were 3 or 4 people that pop up as a potential suspect who all had a blue pickup truck. And a couple of them had a criminal history of sex crimes. So, as investigators kind of wade through this case, this guy began to look more and more as likely a suspect.
And this was, just so we can help the audience out, this is his name Jimmy Nelson?
Yes, I believe he's got the name of Jimmy Nelson, yes.
He's brought in for questioning, and his testimony or statement has got a lot of holes, to the point where he's actually arrested and found guilty of obstruction of justice.
Yes, in fact, a trial in 2008 gets a conviction for murder. However, that is also appealed, and the appeal was upheld, and he was convicted of second-degree murder. Again, due to the appellate issue, the case was reversed and sent back to the civil court.
Okay, all right. This is getting really interesting. So let's talk about the investigation and your role in determining. So we have a missing person. We never have a body, right?
That's correct.
But they were able to achieve a guilty verdict of second-degree murder.
Yes.
So how did that happen, and how did your role come into play here?
Well, I think it's kind of a misnomer that every case is solved by DNA or fingerprints, something like that. The vast majority of murder cases involve a great deal of circumstantial evidence. Now, it is nice if you do have fingerprints, or if you do recover some DNA evidence, or have a witness. But in this particular case, that just was not there. So the prosecutor proceeded on, what seemed to be the likely individual who likely killed the victim, and a jury found him guilty.
Beyond a reasonable doubt, right?
Right. It's not beyond any doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is something that's confusing to most people. When do you reach the point of reasonable doubt or unreasonable doubt? It's one of those things that you almost have to tie to the case itself.
Okay. Well, how is that guilty? How do we reach beyond a reasonable doubt?
Well, generally, you just kind of have to get over the part where can you rule out this person as a suspect based upon, whatever information comes forward. In a case like this, we're talking circumstantial information. He knew her. He denied knowing her. He had a blue pickup truck. He had I think something stand in the local forest up there. And apparently, according to investigators, he never returned to that area. He did participate in a number of the searches in the area. But again, it's kind of one of those things that is up to a jury at the time. Do you think that there's enough here to convict somebody? And in this case, to convict somebody murder.
So how did they reach that beyond a reasonable doubt? What does the investigation find out, or what was your role in helping to achieve that?
Well, I think it's kind of a culmination of issues. When you start looking at one thing, no, that's not enough. Two things, no, that's not enough. But when you get into several things that seem to be related to this woman's, missing, likely murder, then the jury would say, we do think that this guy did it. Yeah, and you got to keep in mind, too, that juries are made up of people from the area. They're not attorneys. They are charged with taking a look at all the information and to come up with, in their best judgment, what the results should be.
Okay, and what was your role in this investigation?
This is a rather convoluted case between the conviction and today. There were several issues that wound up in the appeals court and the Michigan State Supreme Court that back and forth kept looking at the case and either sending it back to re-examine or saying, no, there's just not enough here, even though there is a great deal of circumstantial evidence. No, we don't think that there is. So my involvement really came, I think, around the year 2010 when I was asked to take a look at this, and I did. And I had to testify in the case, and this was a bench trial, so it was just in front of the judge. And I was asked, in my opinion, what would the person responsible for this homicide, in terms of their personality, what would they look like? Now, I can't say, sitting on that stand, I can't point my finger at anyone and say, based upon what I think, that guy did it. But what I can do is tell you the type of personality that we generally see. In fact, it's when I've seen this before, here's what I found to be true. And that's what I did. In fact, the defense attorney never even asked me any questions.
So you were brought in as a criminal profiler to make an assessment about the profile of the murderer, not necessarily of Nelson, but of whoever would have been responsible for this.
That's correct. And I'm not a real advocate of myself testifying in court. I think profiling is an investigative tool, and that's what it should be. Because, as I indicated earlier, I do not have the ability to look at somebody and say, based upon what I know, that guy did it. So that was my role in this case, was to hopefully answer some questions for the judge in terms of how much this person on trial actually fit the profile. And in fact, hardly anybody ever fits it 100%. And so I do know that on those cases that are solved, I usually run around 90% accuracy. But again, we're just talking about a personality assessment, not about an assessment of this particular individual.
Were you retired already at this point? Okay, so this is one of a number of cases that you've been brought out of retirement, so to speak, to give your expert opinion on a very cold case at this point. I mean, if we're talking about 2010, then that's, 30 years after she went missing.
And, I've been very fortunate that I've been able to continue assisting law enforcement here in Michigan, doing profiles, primarily of cold cases now. But, yeah, you're right. I mean, you're talking about at that time, you're 30 years later. And trying to develop an assessment of the information that really is circa 1980. And I don't think anybody should be critical of the investigators in this case, but that happened 30 years ago. And like I said earlier, we didn't have DNA. We had fingerprints. We had some other forensic tools that we could use. But, I think it would be at fault to assume that the detectives did not do their job. I think that they did an excellent job. Just wasn't much there to work with.
So can you tell us a little bit about the profile that you put together for this case and how you came to that conclusion?
Sure. One thing that I absolutely need to do is to know the area where this happened. So, ordinarily, if you say you have a black female as a victim, you generally would look at maybe within that race as a potential suspect. But that area at that time was primarily Caucasian, so the person that did this would likely be a white male. Age range would be probably a little older than the victim. I'd say 25 to 35 years old. Blue collar oriented, primarily in an occupation that is considered blue collar, and he would not be a good employee. Education, high school at the very most. Vehicle, macho sports car or a pickup truck, something like that. And, the residence is going to be in that area. I think that this entire case was something that was a crime of opportunity. Here we find a woman who is basically sitting on the side of the road here, needs help. And what a perfect opportunity for the wrong person to be there. And, in terms of the residence, probably lives in the area, of course, but probably in a kind of a working class house or apartment. And quite often I'd find a person like this to be living with someone, maybe even still living with mom. And, should he be married? I'd say probably a very rocky relationship, maybe even be divorced. In terms of criminal history, I'd say, probably if he's been in trouble, has to do with alcohol-related crime. And one thing that I do know in looking at similar cases is these individuals tend to be chronic liars. They lie even when they don't have to. And that seems to be the case here where, in many instances, the person being interviewed changes the story. Well, you can't change reality. If you say that, I went to this particular restaurant that night and you tell them, no, that restaurant was closed, you couldn't be there, that they pick a whole other restaurant, on the other side of town. Well, that just kind of changed reality. Following the disappearance, I told the investigators that you're probably going to be looking for somebody who had a very strong change of behavior. That means that, if they usually went out to the bar every night, all of a sudden you don't see them for a week or two. Probably tries to stay at home. And the way I refer to this to investigators is they try to shrink their world to get more control in it. He's probably also was very curious about what the police knew back then. This is, area that is not known for a lot of murder cases. So, his behavior might suggest that for whatever reason, in this case, he's really concerned with what the police know. And again, I believed then and I believe now that it was probably a case of opportunity presenting itself. Not that she was stalked or followed in any way. Seems to me that happened and then the wrong person happened to stop by.
Right, because clearly, she wasn't, you couldn't plan around the events that took place, right? She wasn't supposed to really come back to the bar that they went to for the softball game. You wouldn't have been able to plan that she's going to leave to go get her kids. You wouldn't have been able to plan that her car is going to break down twice. And you mentioned that he was helping with the search originally. You think that's another indication of him trying to gain more information about the investigation, also maybe make it look like he's helping, and so he wouldn't be a suspect?
Well, yeah, you do see that. And in this particular case, the fact that he's helping really doesn't say he's guilty. but it may indicate an interest in what the police are finding.
Now, is there any more? So obviously you come in 2000s to make this personality assessment. He was already a suspect, and so there probably was information about him that investigators had, put in the file, right? Was there anything that now when you do these profiles, do you look at that kind of information, or do you not, to remain unbiased in your assessment?
Yeah, I prefer not to know anything about any potential suspect, because I don't want to be, accused later on of saying, you just made that profile fit this guy. That's not the role of profiling. It's certainly not an avenue that I would follow, because it's not important to really make an arrest. It's important to arrest the right guy. And one of the worst things that can happen is to convict the wrong person of the crime.
So I'm curious. You made a lot of very interesting statements about this personality. It's actually pretty detailed there, and I'm curious how you pull these aspects of personality from a crime scene without any information about potential suspects. How did you get to where you make that profile?
Well, you've got a couple things. One, you really have to look at the area. And, this is an area, like I said, it's not known for having a lot of murders. And, if you look at the people who live in that area, it tends to be more of a working class type of environment there. And that is going to be reflected in your offender as well. Age-wise, it's kind of one of the more difficult things to profile anymore, because I find that, if you go back 100 years, a 16-year-old boy was much more mature than a 16-year-old boy is today. And so when I do a profile or an assessment like this, I will say developmentally they're going to behave like an 18-year-old. Now, they could be 30 years old, but they're still living with mom, who still does all his laundry, who still cooks all of his meals. So, yeah, he may be older, but developmentally he isn't. And you actually start to look at other crimes in that area. So, one of the most important things to get going anyway is to look at the area. The other issue has to do with the victim herself.
Are there things about what you learned from the case that, if they would have been different, then it would change your profile? Like, I'm thinking, that her purse was still in the truck, but the keys weren't. So, what does that tell you about the nature of, the perp, right? What are the things that's like, well, if they would have done this, then it kind of leads you down a different path of the profile?
Well, the investigators have to go with what they have. And yeah, her purse was still in her car. Keys were missing. So I guess you can speculate and say that, she accidentally left her purse there, or she was taken much quicker than she thought. But even the people who saw two people in that pickup truck did not indicate that, the victim was being forced into that pickup truck.
Which then indicates likely that the victim knew the murderer. There's a certain level of trust there. 'Cause,
right.
She already didn't get in the car with the three teenage boys. So clearly it must have been someone that she knew.
Right. And that's a very good point.
So I'm curious, has he ever admitted to anything? Do we know what happened after she was abducted? Do we have any information about, how her fate ended?
Well, no, we don't. It would appear that at least he drove the victim away from where the car died. But beyond that, it's basically speculation. And again, I think that, this was a crime of opportunity. And you mentioned, about familiarity between the victim and offender, which I absolutely do believe. And
but we don't have those answers. You mentioned earlier that a lot of times in these cold cases, the family is really just looking for the answers, right?
Yeah, I mean, she had a 4-year-old daughter at the time who deserves to know what happened to her mother. In many cases, just to be able to bury appropriately. But in this case, we don't.
So we, and you mentioned that there was a lot of appeals and a lot of court transpirations, right, going on through all of this. In my research, it appears that he was convicted and he did spend some time in prison, but is that not the end of the story?
No, it isn't. He basically spent time in prison for the perjury aspect, for giving the investigators the wrong information. Obstructing justice would be the appropriate charge. But, he was released initially on an appeal, and ultimately the case against him was dropped. It's my understanding that there's information that an individual who has come up in their investigation is more likely the offender. And actually, that's the way it should be. If he didn't do this, he should not be sitting in prison anywhere. Now, he lied, he committed perjury, obstructed justice, then he needs to respond to that, and he did. But to hold somebody that information that is, I guess, somewhat in doubt in this case, that would be wrong. And again, it's not important to make an arrest for murder. It's important to arrest the right guy who did this.
So my notes here says April 21st, 2014, the Oscoda County prosecutor dismissed the murder charge against him.
That's correct.
So he's scot-free now. Right.
He did his time for the perjury charges, but he is free, and it sounds to me like he should be. I can't get tied up in, getting upset if, a person that seems to fit the profile isn't the one who did it, because I will stand by my profile in this case. It's just going to be applicable to another individual.
Right. So you do believe that they have another suspect in mind?
I think they do have information which suggests that the individual who was arrested for second-degree murder did not commit the crime, that they have information that suggests another individual, and with probably a little more substantial proof, committed this crime.
Do you have any insight, any more than that, on what could be developing?
No, I don't. The record has been sealed, so you really can't go take a look at that, and that's not really my role anyway. My role is to help the investigators in terms of things like, interview strategy, things like that. But my role is always for the victim, and it's as an investigative tool. And I'm pretty sure that whoever did this fit all those other parameters.
Driving a blue truck.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's some things in there, too, that, the person that they did arrest, he apparently hit his car, or his pickup truck, rather, in a wood pile, which, when the heck would you do that? And, there was another issue that popped up in this, which kind of really threw things off for a while. Part of the search included a cadaver dog. And the woman who had the dog had really received a great deal of praise from her work, in the 9/11. And she did some work down in Central and South America. But as it turned out, she was actually planting information, or planting evidence, I guess. And her cadaver dog would go right to it. And in this particular case, I think it was a finger bone that the dog allegedly found. But they were able to determine that all of these hits she'd been having over the years, they weren't really hits.
And she was on this case?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Just to make it a little more convoluted, yeah.
So she's just throwing finger bones, like, out in the woods and being like, we found a finger bone. And
yeah, I think in this particular case, the small area had recently been searched And all of a sudden the dog goes and finds this, I think it was a finger bone, a small bone anyway. And the guy said, that can't be. I just searched that. And I think we know right now that she did it several times. And I believe that we know one thing, and that is the information that she's passing on through these finger bones or whatever, the DNA all comes from the same person. We don't know who that person is. But,
oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Talk about, stirring the whole case sideways here. But yeah.
So she's using the same finger bone or the same hand, or, she's just got, she's only got 10, right?
Yeah. I don't know that they're all finger bones. It seems they were all linked together through DNA, but, the investigators put so much work in this, and now this kind of turns things into a circus. So she was arrested and convicted on that.
Okay, so she caught a case herself.
Yeah.
Which I imagine is some form of obstruction of justice.
Oh, yeah. It's, you're basically like planting fingerprints. You are.
Wow. Well, that is certainly quite a twist. When we hear a story that's as sad as this and we don't have the answers, it's very disappointing to find out that, there are people involved in the investigation that are not moving us closer towards the truth. That is very disappointing. Now, this was 9 years ago that they dismissed this case. And I don't believe we have any further information since. Is that true?
And that's true. And the fact that it came from the prosecutor and the defense attorney tells me that what they have is pretty significant as to who committed the crime. But for whatever reason, it's sealed right now. And, some of the, best feeling I ever get is when I find out that based upon a case that I assisted on, a daughter, a husband, a wife is able to properly bury their loved ones. And that was one thing here that, I know that the girl at the time was very young, but it sure would be nice if we could provide her with the location of her mother so she'd be properly buried. That at least would tell the daughter what happened to her mother. She's been going through all these years, not having a mother, not knowing what happened to her, and that's a shame.
It's very tragic. So your profile, how closely did that match Nelson?
Well, I think it matched fairly close, but again, it's probably going to match all kinds of people up there. It's the little tiny things. So, saying that the guy's a white male, okay, that's fantastic. How many white males do you have up there? What you really have to do is look at it in context. All of these descriptors that I spoke about, all these descriptors come together as person whose personality likely committed this crime.
And I certainly don't want to see anyone imprisoned who is not guilty, but it does seem really interesting to me that he was lying about it. And then, many years later, now he's dismissed.
It's problematic, that's for sure. And that's one of those difficult things that detectives have to face all the time. There are people who lie when they don't even need to lie. And there are people who lie to cover up something else. For example, I've been involved in a number of cases where we know that a guy was a witness to a terrible crime, but he continues to say, I didn't see anything, I don't know anything. And when you find out what happened is that he's out with his girlfriend. He doesn't want his wife to know. So that's the reason.
So he has an alibi, but not a good one.
Right.
Right.
And sometimes we have to put a little pressure on individuals like that to do the right thing. But, if in this case the wrong person was tried and convicted, then I'm ecstatic that he didn't spend any time in prison for that.
Right. So I'm looking at my notes here, and it looks like he did, in October 2006, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison for perjury and obstruction of justice. And then in 2010, is when they had the bench trial, and that's where you were brought in, and that's when he was found guilty. And then 4 years later, he's released.
Yes. After the two trials, this basically just becomes a issue involving the various courts.
Interesting. Yeah, and that seems a little curious that the prosecution defense lawyers told the judge that information had come to light, calling into question the factual basis underlying the state's circumstantial case.
That's correct. And that's pretty rare, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that was my next question.
You just don't see that often unless there's, apparently in this case, something really significant that would lead the prosecutor to say, we got the wrong guy here. There's evidence that, specific, significant evidence that somebody else did this.
When that happens, what is it? Because maybe they're worried about a lawsuit for false imprisonment, or I don't know the vernacular, but is that sometimes a piece of this?
It's possible, yeah. And the prosecutor has the same guidelines as law enforcement. We have to deal with the evidence that we have. You can't manufacture it, and if what you have doesn't reach that significance in terms of finding somebody guilty, then you can't just make up stuff and make sure that this person goes to prison because you think he's a bad guy. We certainly don't want that.
Right. And this was a bench trial for the murder case, and so there was no jury. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In your experience, is a bench trial sometimes better because you're dealing with a judge who I would like to think is more unbiased or has a greater awareness with these things? Is that usually a good thing for a bench trial or no?
A lot of it depends on the judge. If you have a really strong judge who has a history of being a hanging judge, hard on offenders, that would probably be something that the prosecution would enjoy. Otherwise, if you have a judge that tends to be very lenient, very liberal, that might be something that defense attorneys know. And quite often they know before you even go to trial what's going to happen, and they can say, is it worth putting this in the hands of 12 individuals in that area, or should we just trust on somebody like the judge who knows the law, that he will make the correct decision?
Yeah, I guess that's a really good point that, they can lean one way or the other. They're not all cut from the same cloth, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So this was one of the many cold cases that you've worked on since retiring. Was there anything, at this point, you've got an illustrious career of criminal investigation and criminal profiling. So you're really kind of at top of your game at this point, right?
Well, one thing that helps me is I've been involved in so many investigations that it's pretty rare that I come across something that I've never seen before. And that's what I can say is, that 10,000 or so violent crime cases I've been involved in, these are what I find to be true. The offender is, white male, black male, it's about a certain age, have this kind of education and drive that kind of a car, those kinds of things. I've just been fortunate enough to have experienced all that. And, I've had the opportunity to work with some tremendous detectives across the state who really do bring me the information that I need to make an accurate assessment.
Okay, I see this in my notes. Was it true that Jimmy Nelson, who was released, was her brother-in-law?
No, I believe he was the brother-in-law of the babysitter.
Oh, okay.
If memory serves.
Okay. So she was on her way to pick up her kids with the babysitter, and so, interesting.
It's a small community there, with the Air Force Base, that did have some crimes that were somewhat unusual for the area, but for the most part, it's a small town, small area. Many of the people know one another and are related to one another.
Right. It's not a metropolis up there. This is pretty rural Michigan. Like you said, it's a lot of state forest. You got an Air Force Base that makes it maybe a little bit more densely populated than normal. But this is what, north of the thumb, right?
That's correct.
Well, we're coming up on an hour here. Is there anything that you'd like to share about this case that stood out for you in your career, or your expertise? Anything that you learned, or?
Yeah, it is. Again, there are people who actually lie when they don't need to, and that may be the case this investigation. But I'm glad that the person that they put on trial, that it looked like he was not involved in either her being missing or in her murder, that if he didn't do it, then he should never have been charged. He never should have been convicted. And I feel good about that the system worked.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for another episode. And we will talk again shortly in our next episode of In Pursuit of Darkness, A Detective's Journey. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dad.